right. So, yeah, I guess before we start off with Seren's section, it's nice to maybe just pause here and quickly, yeah, reflect on why there's such an urgent need for improved climate-related disclosure, particularly as asset managers play a very important role in this regard. So many people in this discussion would have known that globally, and I think locally, we've also seen a good increase. There's been quite a number of requests around more broader ESG matters, information relating to that, as there's been an increasing realization that improved disclosure is not only important for better decision making and managing risk at both a micro and macro scale, but it also helps companies and financial institutions, as well as governments, to better understand their risk exposure. That meaning both physical and transition risks posed by climate change, and to then be able to strategically plan for the transition to a low carbon economy. In recent months, we've also seen particularly physical impacts of climate change globally play out really extensively in a number of different parts of the world, which has resulted in material financial impacts that governments and various other stakeholders needed to manage, which has led to this increased demand for climate-related financial disclosure to be able to make better investment decision making. So I think the point we're trying to just drive through is that increased disclosure doesn't only stand to benefit one particular kind of stakeholder, but it does really benefit various stakeholders. And by encouraging climate-related financial disclosure by asset owners and asset managers, beneficiaries and other stakeholders will be in a position to better understand the exposures to climate-related risks and opportunities, and then as such be able to make better informed decisions. So yeah, then I quickly just, before we start on the next slides, like to gauge our participants just to see how comfortable people are with different climate-related disclosure frameworks, because I'll be touching on some of these in the next two slides, given that this workshop has a good a deep focus on the TCFD recommendations. So the poll here is, which climate-related disclosure framework are you most familiar with? CDP, TCFD, GRI, or SBTI, so science-based targets. So give it a moment, but for the most part, many people say they're most familiar with the TCFD recommendations, one saying GRI, and I'm glad to see that many have a good familiarity with the TCFD disclosures. It's interesting to see that no one has as of yet mentioned CDP, and I'm saying it's interesting because I'll show you guys now, but CDP and TCFD, there's quite a bit of overlap in terms of some of the themes that's covered by both CDP and TCFD. Okay, so yeah, many participants saying TCFD, only one saying GRI, and then I'll quickly head into just touching on briefly on some of the reporting standards and frameworks. So these reporting frameworks and standards have come about because of the need for credible, timeless, and relevant climate-related disclosures. And these mentioned up on this slide are some of those frameworks that are used to disclose that information. Naturally, many of these have different kind of focus areas geared towards different stakeholder needs, which has up until for a long time resulted in a bit of a misalignment on what information has been kind of reported on, and yeah, not very consistent reporting, unfortunately. But we've seen in the last couple of months there's globally a move towards trying to align some of these frameworks. And I've mentioned earlier that yeah, I find it interesting to see the kind of familiarity around CDP, but it's good. I mean, that means we can share with you guys what we've found from some of the research that we've done. So the CDP runs a global environmental disclosure system for companies, investors, and other entities like cities and different regions. And more than 9,600 companies reported through CDP on climate change, water security, and forests. And that platform provides a mechanism for reporting in line with some of the themes of TCFD. So you'll see here it covers things like governance, risks and opportunities, strategy, targets, emissions, and so forth. And this basically then provides investors and disclosures with a platform where we've now seen that, you know, historically many reporters using this framework has been able to kind of do almost the initial groundwork for if they would like to start with the alignment process to the TCFD recommendations, because a lot of what's required to be disclosed by the TCFD recommendations has historically been covered by many of the questions in your CDP submissions that companies do annually. And Sefaku will kind of expand on some of the research, the data that we found by largely, we've used other kind of sources as well, but I mean, the CDP disclosures were key to some of the data that we were able to find related to climate risk. Yeah, so then just to kind of as a primer and continue with the discussion that, or some of the topics that Seren touched on earlier regarding climate risk. When one considers the broader discussion of climate change, there's obviously risks associated to it, but with that also is a number of opportunities that companies can kind of leverage off to position themselves for this transition. And I guess for our attendees today that work with investee companies, it's important to understand what the potential financial impacts of both the risks and opportunities can be. We'll touch on that a bit in some of the slides, but just to kind of give you guys a bit of a view of what it could potentially mean for investee companies. So let's quickly take a look at the transition risks. So transitioning to a low carbon economy may entail extensive policy, legal and technology, as well as market changes to address mitigation and adaptation requirements related to climate change. And depending on the nature, speed and focus of these changes, transition risks may pose varying levels of financial and reputational risks to organizations. So when talking about policy and legal risks, these are kind of bucketed. So your policy risks relate to policy actions that attempt to constrain actions that contribute to the adverse effects of climate change, or policy actions that seek to promote adaptation to climate change. Some examples of these include carbon pricing mechanisms to reduce GHG emissions and adopting energy efficiency solutions, to encouraging greater water efficiency measures, for example. And then your litigation risks, that specifically relates to the failures of organizations to mitigate the impacts of climate change, and failure to adopt to climate change, and the inefficiency of disclosure around material financial risks. So that's been kind of something that's been brought on by the likes of property owners, municipalities, insurers, shareholders, and other public interest organizations. And that's kind of litigation, relates to litigation around losses and damages that arise from climate change. And I'm sure we can all agree that given the increase in intensity around various extreme weather events that we've seen recently, that's most likely one of the risks that's due to increase in the near future. So when considering technology risks, technological improvements or innovations that support the transition to a low carbon economy can have significant impact on different organizations. These will have effects on, for example, the competitiveness of certain organizations and their production and distribution costs, which will then ultimately in the end impact the demand for their products and services from the end users. And to that extent, in the next few years, we'll certainly see clear winners and losers that emerge from this process, either those that have been able to adapt quickly or those that have been lagging and then need to kind of deal with the fallout of not addressing some of those risks. So when thinking about market risks, these could be affected by climate change, and it's varied and a bit complex, more complex to kind of pinpoint, but these would be driven through things like shifts in supply and demand for certain commodities, products, and services, as they relate to climate risk and opportunities that are increasingly being taken into account by various different stakeholders. Then I think one last risk that's probably top of mind for most organizations at this point is kind of the reputational damages that come with the changing consumer or community perceptions of an organization's contribution or detraction from addressing the transition to a low carbon economy. And that's something that companies will have to actively manage to stay on top of and address that risk as they move through this transition period. So with all big transitions, there's a kind of risk related to it, but there's also upsides to the process. And there's growing evidence around resource efficiency, that organizations are able to successfully reduce their operating costs by improving efficiency across their production and distribution processes, buildings, as well as machinery and appliances, and things like transport and mobility and so on. So this is a nice opportunity for organizations to leverage off if they're able to do so, because it'll result in direct cost savings over the medium to long term, and contribute to the global effort in curbing emissions. So under energy sources, we're seeing this in South Africa as well. There's a growing trend towards decentralized clean energy sources, which has resulted in a rapid decline in costs to users. And we're also seeing globally improved storage capabilities, which enable users to store that generated energy, and then subsequent global adoption of these technologies, which will have significant benefits to the organizations that are able to shift their energy use use to low emission energy sources, and would then in the long term result in annual energy savings on their energy uses. So then in terms of some of the opportunities related to products and services, organizations that are able to innovate and develop new low emission products and services may be able to improve their competitive position and also capitalize on shifting consumer and producer preferences. So some of these examples include products that address carbon footprint and so on. And yeah, this will ultimately be to the benefit of many of the consumers if they're able to innovate and yeah, develop new products and services. So then just lastly, on markets and resilience. So organizations that are able to proactively seek out new opportunities in different markets or types of assets may be able to diversify their activities and then also position themselves for the transition to a low carbon economy. And this concept of climate resilience goes together with the idea of building an adaptive capacity to be able to respond to climate change and to better manage the associated risks, and then also seize the opportunities that go together with the transition period that we're in. So just before closing off and heading into the 4 pillars of the TCFD and their recommendations, I quickly just wanted to put this slide up. I don't think it's necessary to go into too much detail, but I think it's important to kind of, yeah, within the financial industry, to have a good understanding of kind of where your risks and opportunity will ultimately have a financial impact on various businesses. So this slide just shows that fundamentally the financial impacts of climate-related issues on our organizations, on an organization, is driven by specific risks and opportunities to which the organization is exposed to, and its strategic and risk management decisions on managing those risks and seizing those opportunities. And that will be important, and I guess that's probably key to the disclosure of climate-related financial information, is to be able to see and get a good understanding of how companies intend to manage those risks and opportunities over the short, medium, and long term. Okay, so then, Seren, if you can share on your side, I'm going to switch off things on my end for now and stop sharing.